Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings be with you all, and many thanks for tuning in to the Cambridge Muslim College's special pilgrimage season programming entitled The Fifth Pillar, A Pilgrimage Through the Meanings of Hajj. We're so happy to be back with you all on the college's YouTube channel to journey together into the profound meanings of the Hajj and its immense blessings during the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah, with talks every evening at 7 p.m. British Summer Time until Eid. This evening, we take a moment to explore the inner dimensions of pilgrimage by looking at stories and narratives from Islamic history. Pilgrimage is so universal and central in human experience, regardless of time or place, that we can easily narrativize it and overlook the particularities of what audacious, bold, and profound forms of human movement it represents. Because pilgrimage is usually undertaken voluntarily, it represents a form of human behavior that is linked to the deeply hidden and most inner sanctums of what defines us and determines our thoughts, actions, and ways of being in the world. Tonight, we're incredibly fortunate to have the expertise of Dr. Janita Kari to shepherd our exploration of Muslim pilgrimage narratives and the incredible human stories to enact and make living the fifth pillar of Islam, i.e. the Hajj. Dr. Dženita Kari completed her PhD in Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London, and is now a postdoctoral researcher at the Berlin Institute for Islamic Theology at the Humboldt University. Previously, she was a Teach at Tübingen Fellow at the University of Tübingen and also worked at the Oriental Institute in Sarajevo. Her research explores the intellectual history of the early Ottoman period, Hajj and Islam in the Balkans. She has published a number of articles in these research areas and is currently working on her book on the Hajj literature of Bosnian Muslims. So Dženita, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Dženita. So I thought maybe we could start by looking at human mobility and pilgrimage more generally. A lot of your scholarly work looks at the different ways humans move around and the factors involved in that movement. Can you tell us a little bit about the important aspects of what comes up when talking and thinking about mobility generally, and especially as it relates to pilgrimage?
So pilgrimage is definitely a very fascinating phenomenon. If we look at it just as a human activity or as a religious duty, or if we look at it as part of an individual believer's life, even if we compare it to other types of mobilities such as tourism, so pilgrimage always somehow shines out in these comparisons. The thing with the pilgrimage is that it has puzzled different researchers, anthropologists, religious scholars, historians even, for a large part of the 20th century. And I would also say that specifically Islamic pilgrimage or Hajj has been quite puzzling for many of these researchers and scholars. So when we think about pilgrimage in the framework of mobility, I think, of course, naturally the first concept which comes to our mind is movement. So we tend to think about pilgrimage as the physical movement primarily, something which requires people to exert certain type of physical energy or even to undergo certain type of hardships by moving from a place to another place. Also, at the same time, pilgrimage, as we know from different types of religious treatises and literary treatises, pilgrimage is not only physical, but this physical movement somehow ventures into the metaphorical as well. So, for example, when we say life is a pilgrimage, or if we kind of compare life to a pilgrimage, we still think of pilgrimage as something which means going through different phases, going through different types of let's say hardships. So movement is definitely one. Then we also, when we think about pilgrimage, we think of change, we think of transformation. So people go on pilgrimage to change something about themselves or about their community, about their family. They sometimes have a certain specific aim in mind why they're undergoing pilgrimage, or why they are performing pilgrimage. So this element of transformation has occupied, again, a large number of scholars throughout the 20th century, especially those who were working those who worked on the Christian pilgrimage. Change is definitely one important part of it, but we also have the continuity. So for some people, pilgrimage is the continuity of their active religious life, of their active religious practice. So it's not only the transformation which is important, but it's also like the culmination of a certain type of continuity which existed before. So in certain ways, we can definitely look into pilgrimage from so many different angles. We can look at the pilgrimage from the individual angle, so what the pilgrimage does to an individual person, or what it does to a community as a whole. In that regard, many scholars throughout the 20th century, as I said, they tried to work on the meanings of the pilgrimage. And there was this very overt focus on how do we define pilgrimage in general, but also what do we do with Hajj? So Hajj has been a specifically tough problem for many scholars, because you have set rites which haven't changed. And of course, we all know that there are distinct religious narratives behind each of these rites. But then again, each individual believer imbues these rites with meanings which are, very particular, very distinctive. So that was something which puzzled many people throughout the 20th century. And I especially like the essay by Marion Katz, which I like to quote very often, where she, in a way, compares the pre-modern and modern perspectives on Hajj and the way meaning plays into that. And basically what that essay inspired me, and I hope it inspired many other scholars as well, is to look not only into meanings which people have given to Hajj, but also to look what Hajj actually did. So just the from the practical side, what Hajj means to people, what Hajj does to people in their very common lives, in their ordinary lives.
So Dženita, maybe you could just elaborate a little bit about why Hajj formed such a complex issue for these scholars working on pilgrimage.
So I would say that a part of the problem lies in the modern fixation on finding meaning, finding a very strict and one meaning, which is something which Hajj does not allow. So you have a framework, of course, the rights are set and that's definitely fixed, but meanings are something which is imbued by individual believers, by the communities. And sometimes it's not only about meanings, it's about what Hajj does for these people. So for example, when we talk about, for example, standing on the Arafat, many scholars would try to find the deeper meaning behind it. But maybe for a lot of believers, that just means that it's like obeying God and respecting duties, and that's it. So I would say that this is probably the result of as I said, the modern fixation on tracking meanings. So everything has to have a very, very fixed, strict meaning, and Hajj is simply way beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So something you highlight in your work in this incredible aspect of pilgrimage is that not only do people undertake these journeys, but they write about them. Can you explain why that's significant, why this writing about it is significant, and some of the ways that it appears in sources?
So this impulse to write and its connection to pilgrimage is something which is, of course, not it doesn't work exclusively for Muslims. I think one of the first pilgrimage narratives of Christianity was by Egeria, who wrote her pilgrimage account and dedicated it to her sisters in the 4th century. So in a way, writing about pilgrimage is a universal phenomenon in some ways. And of course, when we look at different travelogues from Islamic history, we can see that a large part of it is dedicated to Hajj. And I would say that there are probably two main reasons why people wrote about Hajj, to put it very, very roughly. So the first one is people needed to pass on the information to the pilgrims who would come after. So people wrote about very practical things, such as, well, this is the way you go to Mecca, and you have to stop here, and you have to stop in, I don't know, Damascus, and then you pass this place and that place. And sometimes it would be really, really, you would get like very down-to-earth information, very mundane information. You have food and water in this place, but there is not enough fresh water in the village next to it. Sometimes this mundane crosses over into other realms. So people would write about different ziyarat on the way to Hajj. They would mention, for example, tombs of different awliya, of Prophet's companions. So sometimes it would venture into some other aspect, and then it would, in a way, connect the main mobility, the main purpose with, other types of smaller, lesser pilgrimages on the way to Hajj.
So was this sort of conscious? Was this consciously done? Is this kind of narrative, descriptive, or is it prescriptive? Like, i.e., walk this way and take this turn and visit this site on your way, and here's how to.
You have both. You have both. You have narrative and you have prescriptive as well. You have different types of those writings which are directed to the future pilgrim. So it's, in a way, future-oriented. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that's just one aspect of writing about Hajj. And the question of why people write about Hajj has been really bothering me for years. And what I come to realize is that there is definitely another reason why people write about Hajj. And that is they simply want to expand or extend their experience of Hajj beyond the very space and time limitations of the Hajj ritual. So they want to, in a way, earn the virtuous deed beyond the confines of the Hajj ritual itself. So they write about their experiences. So they write about their very internal experiences about Hajj, because they want to get another, they simply want to extend the experience. And this is also the reason why you get many authors who are not just ulama, so not only very highly literate or very highly educated members of the society, but you also get people who, for example, would write about Hajj, and that would be probably the only thing that they would write in their lives. And of course, this is just one aspect of it. We also have, apart from Hajj writings, we also have different types of expressions of this particular religious experience in folk songs, in folklore, in visual culture. So this writing about Hajj is just one aspect of it.
And what would you say are some of the ways that this plays out in Muslim sources? I mean, what kinds of pilgrimage, the actual narratives themselves, what kinds of things, and can you give us some examples of, in the broader context in Muslim sources, what we find kind of Hajj narratives?
So Muslims, they wrote in a number of genres. So it's not only the travelogue genre or the travel writing. So of course, travel writing is something which comes first to one's mind, because it's very prominent, it's very visible. It's those sources are, in a way, very interesting to read. And they do describe Hajj both as journey and as a ritual, which you don't really get in some other sources. So of course, we have a large number of very famous Hajj narratives, or Hajj narratives which are embedded in larger parts, or Hajj narratives which are embedded in larger works or larger travelogues by Ibn Battuta, by Ibn Jubayr, by Evliya Çelebi, and later on. What is also really interesting to note is that there is a surge in writing about Hajj in the form of the travel writing in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, especially from the side of, let's say, Muslim converts. So in a sense, Hajj narrative travelogue in that regard becomes almost a confessional literature as well, because people are writing not only about Hajj itself, but they're also writing about themselves. So that's one part of the whole, let's say, corpus of literature of writing about Hajj. On the other hand, we have a large number of different genres which are talking specifically about places. And they're talking specifically about the virtues of these places. So, for example, the Fadail literature is extremely rich in that regard. The Fadail, especially of Mecca and Medina, which were highly influential, which were read by not only the ulama, but also the different parts of the society, of pre-modern society, which stressed the inner virtue, the inner preference or fadila of these places. And then, of course, you have also writings which are dedicated specifically to certain parts of these places. So what I find really interesting is, for example, Ibn Arabi's treatise or his treatment of the Black Stone of Hajar al-Aswad, which in a way got its reflection in the 16th and the 17th century Ottoman thought as well. So the writings about Hajj are really diverse, and pre-modern writings about Hajj are as diverse as the modern writings on Hajj. And modern writings on Hajj are specific because they employ a different type of, they employ a variety of media as well. So what we see in the modern sources is the inclusion of photography, for example, drawings, and also in the, let's say, last couple of decades, what you can see is the emergence of the Hajj narratives, which are published online. So it's a completely different, let's say, media, which at the same time conveys the same continuous message of devotion to Hajj and devotion to Mecca and Medina.
Mm-hmm. Would you say there's any more significant differences between these pre-modern and modern perspectives? How did they differ in their perspective?
So first of all, I would say that they definitely show to us the continuity of devotion to Hajj and Mecca and Medina. So the zeal to see these places, to go on Hajj, I would say that it's definitely the same in the pre-modern and the modern period. So that is something which doesn't change. But I would say that the experience itself is not timeless. So it definitely is influenced by sociocultural context, sometimes by political context as well. So I would say that the role of different empires produced different types of literature, of course. And in the 20th century, in the modern period, nation state created or influenced people to think in some different ways. But if I were to kind of divide at least the material I was working on into two pre-modern and modern aspects, I would definitely say that the pre-modern literature on Hajj is marked by prophet-oriented devotion, and modern literature on Hajj is more socially oriented. So that's definitely the let's say the division which I see on the literature I was working on. So the pre-modern literature is devoted in a large part to the significance of the prophet in the framework of Hajj. So the significance of Medina almost. On the other hand, the modern Hajj is preoccupied by the effect which Hajj can have on people, on communities, on nations beyond the confines of Mecca and Medina. So that would be a very rough division, or at least something which I saw in my own material.
That's so fascinating. I think it's a perfect way to bridge into your material, actually, because we're so fortunate to have you here not only as a scholar of Muslim mobility history, but also an expert on Bosnian Hajj narratives, in which we can really get a sense of how this idea of nation and who and where you belong in the world can play out in a really significant way. So, can you tell us about your work in this area and what we can learn about Bosnian Hajj stories and narratives?
So what I tried to do with my first thesis now book, inshallah, is I wanted to see how people experienced Hajj from the perceived margins of the Muslim world. So these margins are, of course, artificial, perceived. They are created. They are not real, but they still function as something important for many scholars and for many people as well. So I wanted to see how Bosnian Muslims experienced Hajj in a long duration perspective, so from the 16th to the 21st century. I wanted to see what changes. I wanted to see how the social context influences their way, how they perceive the Hajj, and also how they, in a way, influence the writing on that tradition themselves. So in that sense, I was kind of playing with the concept of discursive tradition. So how do Muslims contribute to this tradition as well? It's not only that they build upon, it's not only that they, follow the tradition, but they also bring something new into it. At the same time, what I could notice is that although, of course, there is a very particular, very distinct perspective of Bosnian Muslims, especially in the modern period, there is also a chain of continuities, a chain of ways in which Bosnian Muslims are connected with their brothers and sisters across the Muslim world. And sometimes these connections are, of course, framed by the imperial framework. So, for example, Ottoman Bosnian Muslims wrote in the same style, in the same genre, in the same language, even as their counterparts in Anatolia or in Arab provinces. So there's practically no difference between these two, between them. But at the same time, you of course notice a very local, very peculiar perspective on certain issues related to the journey to Hajj, for example. So I wanted to see both the particular and the, let's say, universal or general about Bosnian Muslims and their experience as, as a community which is set in a very geographically interesting region and historically very interesting region.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell us, Dženita, really as a way of letting us preview into this world, because I think, as we were discussing before, so many of us will have so little insight into the world of Bosnian Hajj. What sorts of stories did you come across, and what sort of inner worlds did you uncover in your research of this?
So the stories are very, very diverse. The genres are diverse, and sometimes you don't really get the full inner perspective of the author because of the constraints of the genre. But I would say that in my work, I've divided it into several periods. So the first period, when we see the emergence of the literature about Hajj and the literature about Mecca and Medina, is 16th and the 17th century. And the works we get from this century are usually written by Sufi Muslims. So, for example, Ali Dede al-Bosnawi, who was a very interesting person who was a guardian of a tomb of Sultan Suleiman in Hungary, in what's modern-day Hungary. So he was also appointed to oversee a reconstruction of a part of Harem in Mecca. So he wrote a couple of works dedicated to this. So what we can see there is, what I found really interesting is that their sense of locality, their sense of their local origin from Bosnia, is only visible in their basically in the part of their name, which is Al-Bosnawi. It's not really visible when they're talking about Hajj. It's not visible when they're talking about holy places. So it seems to me that they are fully immersed in their impression of the holy, forgetting their origins, or maybe not even, I mean, forgetting it is not a great word, maybe not regarding it as something which is important in that particular moment, or when writing about this particular place. I would also like to mention Abdullah Bosnawi, who was an extremely important interpreter of Ibn Arabi's work in the early modern Ottoman period. So he has a treatise where he explains Ibn Arabi's view on the Black Stone. So I found that treatise extremely interesting because he is actually giving the primacy to the stone over the humans. So he completely inverts the hierarchy, places this stone, which is humble, above humans and plants and animals and all other created beings. So he completely inverts the hierarchy there. When we move slightly towards 18th century, the number of authors who are writing about Hajj is increasing. So we have not only the ulama, which was in service of the Sultan, but we also have different merchants, traders who are writing about Hajj. What appears there is this slightly rising sense of locality, of local consciousness. So people are aware that they're Bosnian and that they're going to Hajj as Bosnian Muslims. And that's what I found really interesting, because they compare themselves to other Muslims. They anticipate other Muslims as well. So they want to meet the other. So in some sense, when I was reading these manuscripts, and many of them were in Ottoman Turkish, especially those which mentioned Bosnia a lot, I was reminded how utterly wrong Bernard Lewis was when he said that Muslims were not interested in, discovering the other, exploring, etc. Muslims were simply focused on, many Muslims were extremely focused on meeting the other Muslim, so fellow brothers and fellow sisters. So as we move into the modern period, so the late 19th century, early 20th century, that's when this range of meanings given to Hajj starts to appear. And sometimes, yes, sometimes you can see the direct influence of the very common, very, let's say, certain types of opinions which circulated in this period. So, for example, there is a lot of comparison between Hajj and socialism, for example, or Hajj and how Hajj is rational, how Hajj is a rational ritual. So there is a lot of that. But at the same time, what I think is, yes, you would have these, let's say, mainstream narratives which had to be written because sometimes, people read certain things and they wanted to write about things in the fashion of their age. But sometimes you would get like true rebels who wrote about Hajj, such as, for example, Sheikh Faizullah Hajj Bayrić, who in 1969, I think, wrote about Hajj from a Sufi perspective, which was simply, at that time, it was not something which was usually done. So he wrote it he tried to find, both Zahir and Batin of Hajj, and he really tried to trace the symbolical value of Hajj. So it's really hard to, in a way, point out the Bosnian Muslim perspective on Hajj. So there is not one perspective on Hajj. There is a multiplicity of these different perspectives on Hajj. What I find interesting in the 20th century is the rise of, let's say, marginalized voices, or the voices which were not present that much in the pre-modern period. So, for example, women start writing about Hajj in large numbers. And I always mention a very interesting case of two ladies who went on Hajj driving by themselves all the way to Mecca. And then they wrote about Hajj as well. And their Hajj narrative, I mean, the very path of this Hajj narrative is really interesting because they did not publish it immediately after they returned back from Hajj in 1981. It would be, I think, in that time, it would be probably a bit dangerous for them to publish something like that. But one of them died in 2013, and that is when her travelogue was published. So I was interested to see not only the stories of these pilgrims, but also how what happened to their work. Because I think the Hajj travel accounts themselves have a very distinct path as well. So a variety of perspectives on Hajj is definitely something which characterizes the Bosnian Hajj.
Janita, is there any difference? I mean, you touched on this just now. First, with the increase of women travel, right? I mean, we would love to hear more about these two driving rebels. They sound like a very fascinating story. If you wouldn't mind maybe sharing a little bit more about that with us too. And then the second thing I wanted to ask you was, under the sort of what most outsiders assume was a repressive sort of communist Yugoslavia, how did Hajj play out during that time? And what did the Hajj even look like during that time? So those would be my two questions.
So basically, I mean, those two questions are definitely intertwined. So I'll just start by saying that although, of course, there was a state ban on certain religious activities, there was a state ban on face veil, which was issued, I think, in 1950. So there were a lot of restrictions for Muslims in that period. Still, the restrictions somehow slowly started to ease as, the decades of the Yugoslav rule passed. So what we can see from the sources is that public life of Muslims was restricted, but religious life or devotional life was never severely restricted. So people could still go to mosques. They could still, practice religion in some ways, maybe even better than some of the surrounding countries. So what happened with Hajj is that in the beginning of the Yugoslav rule, Hajj was allowed only for a very select few of people, those who were approved by the state, and Hajj was also utilized. It was used as a way for Yugoslavia to present itself as a state which is benevolent towards its Muslim population. So, you select a couple of people who are going to Mecca, and they are going to talk nicely about Yugoslavia, and then when they come back, they write, these Hajj travelogues, and then they present Yugoslavia as benevolent state to its own citizens. So it was, Hajj was used in both ways. However, later on, with the rise of travel agencies, especially in the 1960s, so with the rise of jet travel and then bus travel as well, there an ever-increasing number of Muslims is going on Hajj. So the numbers have increased towards 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. The travelogue of these two women, which I mentioned earlier, their travel happened in the 1981. So one of them was a member of, when she was young, she was a member of the Young Muslim Movement in Bosnia, which was, of course, an organization which was outlawed after the Second World War. So she spent a couple of years in prison. Because she had that experience of being in prison, she needed to kind of not be so visible with her Hajj travel in the 1980s, although, her past was behind her, Yugoslavia was seemingly benevolent towards Muslims going on Hajj. Still, she wanted to kind of keep low and stay out of public eye. So she and her friend, together with their husbands, decided to go on Hajj by car. Because in that way, unlike going on Hajj by bus or going on Hajj by airplane, you could still kind of hide your trace. So, you could say that you're going to visit your relatives in Turkey, or that you're going to, see Damascus or Cairo. So nobody really questioned you about that. So that's what they did. So they took a car and they drove all the way to Mecca and Medina. And it was really interesting to see that they were not stopped by the Saudi authorities. They were stopped a couple of times, but they were let go. So they were driving through Saudi Arabia like without going through any kind of trouble. And what was really interesting for me to notice is that one of them was working, but the other one was a housewife. And how the two of them embedded a very common socialist slogan, which is brotherhood and unity, something which you hear everywhere. So they embedded this slogan, brotherhood and unity, in their travelogue, saying, well, Ummah is the true brotherhood and unity. So they used the slogan, they used the socialist slogan, but they appropriated it for their own purposes. And that's something which I found really fascinating, how people can actually use something which they see as, common good. It's a good slogan, brotherhood and unity, bratstvo, jedinstvo. But then you use it for your own purposes to kind of express your own feeling about what is the true brotherhood and unity for you. So the two of them went on Hajj and returned from Hajj without any problems. And then the travelogue of Hidayata was finally published after she died.
Dženita, what an incredible story. You've got some great images here, which you've very kindly shared with us, which also kind of give more color to these incredibly human stories that you've been sharing. Can you tell us about these photographs that you've got?
So basically, the first one is the image I took from the archives in Sarajevo. And this is a part of the Dalai Lag, which depicts, as you can see, different objects related to Mecca. And what I find really interesting here is this portable stairs in the lower right corner of the picture, of the painting. And I've inquired around, and apparently those are portable stairs which people used to be able to climb up to the doors on Kaaba. But it's really, really peculiar, and I've never seen portable stairs used like this in a manuscript, because in the beginning I just thought it's actually, the portable mimbar or something. And apparently there is such thing as portable mimbar as well. So I think it's kind of an interesting image, and shows what attracted the attention of the 18th century painter / author / copyist.
Incredible, yeah. And this one?
So this is a postcard taken from which I found in the book titled Kutsal Yolculuk, or The Holy Journey, by like a set of different postcards on Hajj collected by Murat Kargili. And this one depicts Bosnian Muslim women seeing off Hajis somewhere towards the late 19th century. And this one, I think, is also from the same period. What I found interesting on this postcard is that there is this depiction of train. So it's really interesting how modern technology immediately found its way into depictions of Hajj, into narrations of Hajj, and it's definitely one of the key elements of the modern Hajj as well. This is something which attracted my attention when I visited my relatives in the northwest part of Bosnia. Basically, around certain mosques or around graveyards, you can see a number of these stones which carry the name of the person, which also carry the short note, Obavio Hajj or Obavila Hajj, which means performed Hajj for both male and female. And there are 2 dates here. So the first one is when the person was born. The second one is not when the person died, but when the person went on Hajj. So I thought it was really interesting how the life is in a way circumscribed by the year of birth and the year of Hajj, which is performed, and not necessarily by the year when the person died. And for me, this is also really interesting because it shows us the way how Hajj can leave traces on the local territory, or it left, traces in a village which was far away from Mecca and Medina. So it's visible for the majority of Muslims who are never going to be able to go on Hajj, because realistically, majority of Muslims are not able to go on Hajj. But Hajj still features as something extremely important in their lives. So also it kind of marks their environment.
How incredible to be memorialized in plaque form like this. That's incredible.
Yes. Yeah. And I also think that they actually revised, they tried to rejuvenate the custom in the early 21st century. So I think it's really nice. And maybe we could end by quoting these two excerpts from two travelogues which are separated by a couple of centuries. So the first excerpt is by Haji Yusuf Livnjak from the 17th century. So his travelogue is the first known Bosnian travelogue in first person. Maybe there were more travelogues written before the 17th century, but we don't know. We simply don't have any other travelogue in physical form that we can point to. So I thought this excerpt was really interesting because it says, "Thanks be to God who made me closer to the Prophet's mosque, and with his generosity allowed me to reach Ahmed's Qibla and brought me to visit the graves of God's friends who are perfect and perfected. They are friends of God and the Prophet's deputies. Salawat are said for him, the one who God said Lawlake, and his descendants who are the fruits of kings, and his followers who are distinguished by the usage of miswak." So many things to unpack here, but just quickly, he refers here to the hadith, "Lawlake, lawlake, lama khalaqtul aflaq," which was commonly used in Sufi texts of this period, and is obviously directed to the Prophet Muhammad. And also what I found really interesting is that he emphasizes his belonging to the community which uses miswak. So that was, for him, that was the community he wanted to belong to. The second excerpt is the excerpt from the travelogue of Hidayat Amirovic, which I talked about, when she describes her night under the Arabian stars, as she put it. So she says, "We slept outside, got into our sleeping bags, and thus spent our first night in the desert. It is a special experience. The sky is full of stars and is close. The desert makes you think only of Allah, and I had a feeling that the whole dunya was left behind us, and that I'm here with my life account in front of Allah. I could not sleep for a long time, and that is when I realized the purpose of Hajj." But what is interesting is that she doesn't really say what the purpose of Hajj is. So she probably couldn't express it in the words. And that's also something which is a common feature of the travelogues, because of Hajj travelogues. People describe their experience of Hajj, but sometimes words are not enough. So sometimes what you get is a very detailed description of other places on the way to Hajj. But Hajj gets like a very, very short, just very like short passage or two, probably because people thought that they couldn't put everything in words.
That is so beautiful, Dženita. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I am just so grateful to you for sharing your insights on Hajj narratives, and especially your expertise on Bosnian Hajj stories, since we're only just beginning to obtain a more in-depth understanding of these particular narratives, thanks in large part to the work that you're putting in to bring them to the fore. You've shown us how movement and mobility takes place for all sorts of reasons, and the importance of recognizing pilgrimage as an extraordinary movement of people, one that gives us insight into the lived devotional lives of people who undertake these journeys. And in so doing, you reminded us how the pillars of Islam fundamentally are about making the ordinary extraordinary, or recognizing the potential for sanctity innate to all things, all parts of lived experience, from the ones we endeavor to undertake in every moment, like the Shahada, to those we attempt once in a lifetime, like the Hajj, made so profoundly clear by that beautiful quote from Hidayata. I want to thank you also for giving us a window into the richness of Hajj travelogues, firstly as a window into the historical logistics and practicalities, and also importantly into the inner devotional lives of non-elite Muslims, showing us inspiring stories of human ingenuity, capacities for exertion and courage, and of course, sincerity even in the face of hardship. And also how these stories tell us so much about larger context. I mean, that's a story that we have to hear from you at another time as well, as what these travelogues are, what they enable us to understand about larger stories. And importantly, I'm so grateful that you showed us the diversity and range of what writing about the Hajj journey looks like. This seems especially important in the modern age when we're able to share with much more immediacy and convenience. And yet there's certainly a difference between Insta live streaming one's experience and writing it with that critical pause between experience of event and recording of it, so central to when we write about the human experience, especially the human experience of pilgrimage. Dženita, thank you so much for your time and brilliant insights.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of the perspectives of my Hajjis, because I'm calling them my Hajjis. And I hope I did them right.
You very much did. And I think we're all very excited for your book now. So please take all our dua that this book reaches fruition, and we'll be very excited to read it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in and for your continued support of the tremendous work that the Cambridge Muslim College undertakes. I wish you all a truly blessed and beautiful season of pilgrimage and the glad tidings of Eid. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Support the next generation of Muslim thinkers by donating today at cambridgemuslimcollege.ac.uk.